Welcome back. Well, we continue with that discussion about France's post-election victory for Emmanuel Macron, the first president to be re-elected in 20 years. But what does it all mean, actually? Well, we spoke before the break to Head of Communications in the French Embassy here in South Africa. Let's go to France now, in Paris. And there we're meeting independent journalist Harrison Stetler to get his thoughts. Harrison, good to talk to you. We've had a few conversations before the elections, and I suppose in many ways the results were not a surprise. Or do you think that the margin of victory was a little bit higher than anticipated?
Well, there were certainly some polls in sort of the days leading up to the first round of the elections, maybe around April 8th, 9th, 10th, which showed Le Pen clearly on an upward trajectory. Since I think specifically the debate last week, but also sort of because of the layout of the sort of between the rounds, that margin sort of started to grow again. So this, I think, is more or less close to the result that people have been expecting for the last sort of few days, at least perhaps the last week. So there is a certain, I guess, sentiment of maybe anticlimax, whereas there really were a few sort of big shifts in voting expectations before the first round. The layout of things on Sunday is more or less close or similar to what people were expecting, I think. Nonetheless, though, calling it an anticlimax is maybe a bit of an overstatement. Nonetheless, you still see what is the highest historical score for the far right, which has. It was interesting watching sort of the presentation of the results last night. At least from my perspective, to see that sort of detail drifting sort of increasingly into sort of the background. But this just three, I think, figures really get to the degree of the main story of the night, which is Marine Le Pen has scored nearly 42%. She's increased her, I guess, share of the second round vote by nearly 8% relative to 2017. To say nothing of the score that her father earned in 2002 when he lost in the second round to Jacques Chirac by some sort of, and when he earned only 18%. So the sort of deep story, the rise of the French far right, is not over.
Why do you think the French far right is on the rise, and we're seeing socialists and Republicans on the verge of extinction?
Well, I think they're similar. There are intertwined sort of developments going on. You mentioned sort of the near disappearance of the two former sort of governing parties of the Fifth Republic, the Socialists, and sort of the Republicans, formerly known as the UMP. And as far as the rise of the far right, I think one sort of the common maybe explanation I think that most people will hear is that Marine Le Pen, relative to her father, has sort of embarked on a strategy of what I guess the French call sort of her demonization, whereas her father was sort of even more uncouth and sort of, I guess, even more demagogic or direct with what he actually believed. Marine Le Pen has sort of sought to sort of recalibrate and sort of soften some of that. I think what's more important than that sort of maybe narrative about the change in the far right and its expanding sort of clout in French politics is really to think of the degree to which the far right has been normalized by the rest of the political class. You've seen over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years, figures elsewhere throughout, I guess, the French political field, cherry picking with increasing intensity, sort of the talking points, the themes, and the solutions of the Le Penist force. So this is only helpful to a party if you're trying to legitimize yourself as a political force. Nothing will help you more than other forces also, I guess, copying to a certain degree your solutions. And this, I guess, trait of, I think, many of the sort of establishment political forces has continued apace through Macron, who as a political figure, has drawn together a coalition, including many figures from the former socialists and the former Republicans. But I would say that is where I'd really sort of put I guess, the explanation as far as the far right's growing clout in France.
All right, so it's going to be interesting what happens next, because the National Assembly vote is going to happen. Mélenchon seems to be a really popular figure. He didn't make it through the presidential round, so whilst the focus might be on Marine Le Pen, could Mélenchon then come through the National Assembly?
Well, that is, I guess, the question now, and that will sort of be the question for the next 6, 7 or so weeks, when mid-June, I guess, we'll have the legislative elections. Mélenchon, I guess, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the sort of left-wing force, France Insoumise, running this year under sort of what's called the Popular Union. Last week, he sort of gave a major interview to the press where he said, I asked for the French to sort of elect me prime minister. I guess before that, I guess what is going to really be happening, at least specifically over the next few days, one thing that's crucial to watch: to what degree are the left-wing forces that were not united before the first round, are they able to come to some sort of agreement? That is going to be sort of on two levels. There will have to be some negotiations as far as sort of a program, and the Mélenchonists are quite insistent on the fact that sort of a unity be around their program for France. But the degree of sort of an alliance will also sort of have to question sort of in which districts will candidates be running. So will you have sort of Mélenchonist candidates running against ecologists, or will they sort of divide and conquer? These sorts of negotiations are going to be happening, I guess, throughout the sort of political field. You're going to have Macron also trying to sort of cherry pick people from the old center right. He's also hoping to get a few sort of conversions from the socialists still, even though I guess the major sort of conversion of sort of former socialists to Macron was in 2017. And then on the right, I guess, or around Le Pen, there is Eric Zemmour, who came in fourth after Mélenchon, well behind Mélenchon at nearly or some sort of 7% in the first round. He, I guess, like many other candidates, also gave an address last night after Macron's victory, and he sort of called for he made the claim that there needs to be sort of a broad right-wing alliance, bringing sort of the old right wing of the Republicans, including his force, all the way to sort of Le Pen. As far as legislative elections, that I guess one thing to note is that this was, I guess, the first time in 20 years that France has had its sort of incumbent president reelected. The sort of caveat to that is that, and this is a quite technical matter, but it's actually very important for sort of understanding some of the political dynamics, is that Macron was the first figure reelected with a parliamentary majority, because at the beginning of the century you had the transition from sort of France's traditional 7-year terms to 5-year terms, which basically meant that instead of having parliamentary elections 2 years before the end of a presidential term, which was more or less sort of the convention before, you now have the two sort of synchronized. So that, I guess, will change the dynamic of the legislative elections, which, because Macron is elected, has been reelected and is not sort of a new president, he will most certainly sort of benefit less from the effect that he had in 2017 when he earned a clear sort of parliamentary mandate from the legislative election results.
So some people,
as far as prognosis, I don't know what I would say.
Some people are suggesting that one of the reasons why Macron succeeded is that there's no democratic alternative to Macron.
Well, surely in the second round there wasn't a democratic alternative. As I compared sort of the historic voting results earlier, and we discussed this, I believe, last time I was on. But nonetheless, many voters supported Macron not for his program, but exactly as you said, to sort of defeat an alternative which clearly represented in their eyes a threat to sort of Republican institutions. So insofar as France will have, or is going to have, an opposition between sort of such and such a sort of centrist political figure and the far right, And as far as the far right sort of stays true to its sort of legacy, I guess that will be the case. But no, there are absolutely democratic alternatives to Macron. But because of the function of the French electoral system, they were not on the ballots this past Sunday.
So is he going to have some really difficult conversations after the National Assembly elections?
I think, Macron's problems are by no means resolved by the result. Obviously, you've seen many of his sort of spokesmen and spokeswomen on Sunday night since then, sort of declaring this election as a, I guess, new electoral mandate for the president. Macron was, in his speech yesterday in Paris, was a bit more, I guess, humble than a lot of his spokespeople who, and he in his speech admitted that he knew many people voted for him not for his program but just to block the far right. So the question is, how is he going to navigate that? Like in 2017, he said, I am going to sort of try to earn that support and make it not just a support out of, I guess, default or for tactical reasons to block the far right, but support sort of by conviction. How is he going to do that? Is he going to? He's discussed he's discussed what he's called sort of a new method for governing. Will he include sort of what the French call intermediary bodies, i.e. sort of associations, unions, many of sort of the civil society actors that throughout the last 5 years were more or less sort of left by the wayside as Macron embarked on a quite sort of centralized governing model. So will he learn those lessons of sort of the governing strategies that fueled a lot of the popular anger that have characterized French politics for the last 5 years? Or will these sort of electoral promises just be that, electoral promises? I guess only time will tell. One can hope that he will take his promise seriously, that his main goal is resisting the far right, and that he will open himself up to a bit of sort of political flexibility to incorporate sort of the perspectives of all the people who voted for him by default. But it's too early to tell. The questions where we'll really be able to start getting an answer to that will be on the question of retirement reforms, which will most likely be kicked off in September. And that is, I guess, the major sort of legislative question, which is going to be resolved in the next few months, I think.
All right, so he should enjoy his champagne for a few days, but things certainly far from over for him. Harrison, we're going to have to leave it there. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye. All right, that's independent journalist Harrison Stetler giving us his take on the French elections. And it looks like a country that's evolving and moving forward. The far right, Marine Le Pen, her party is growing in significance. The established parties, the Socialists and the Republicans, disappearing. Centrists led by Emmanuel Macron could be celebrating re-election. But where will they be